everybody. Thanks for coming out here on this very rainy night and coming to Zoom. It's great to see you guys. So I am, can you not hear me?
Not very well.
Okay. Hold on one sec. I can talk louder, but it might be the mic.
Is the mic right by?
It looks like it's.
Can you tap it? Let me try something else.
Okay. Maybe I turned it off by accident. Okay, you hear me now? Okay, excellent. So this presentation was originally called How to Really Save the Bees, Creating Habitat for Native Pollinators, but I expanded it to for pollinators and other insects because I find that it's really hard to extract one from the other because they're all contributing to habitat for us and for them in so many different ways. And it feels pretty reductive to single out these amazing animals to just one role because they play so many different important and fascinating roles, not just on our farms, but even in our home landscapes. They're not just pollinators, they're also predators and decomposers and seed dispersers and prey for other animals. So we're going to talk about as many of them as we can today, and I specifically want to show you what's possible to see and to protect right here in Maryland, right outside your door. And I'm sure you've all heard in some fashion some of the numbers about the worldwide insect declines and the insect apocalypse that's occurring for an extraordinary number of species. So instead of rehashing those, I'll just mention some of the more recent research and studies throughout this talk. There was a new study in the journal Science a few weeks ago that looked at butterfly abundance and showed a 22% drop in the past 20 years in the US. And it even included some really common species like the cabbage white butterfly, which is an introduced butterfly from Europe. And as a lot of you know, if you're gardeners, they're usually very abundant. And there's fewer of them now. And this study echoed some of the declines that I have witnessed myself over the past 25 years. Such as the increasing loss of this great spangled fritillary butterfly. We used to have dozens of them at a time in our garden, and now I'm lucky if I see one or two every summer. So it's declined pretty much throughout its range, in the southeast by up to 90%. American bumblebees are another species we still have in our garden, and we actually see them more now than we used to, but overall, they've been disappearing across their range. They've vanished from about 8 states, and they've been considered for federal endangered species listing. I don't know what's going to happen with that now, but we can try to figure out what we can do in our own spaces, at least, to help these guys. And that is the good news, is that if we give them more habitat in our communities and even in our home spaces, and if we start nurturing more plants and other habitat elements in even small areas like our own backyards, we can make a difference and stem the tide of some of these losses. Just to take one of the most recent examples from the scientific literature, that article or that paper on butterfly declines in Science did talk about the fact that restoring native small landscapes like hedgerows, backyards, has great potential for increasing suitable habitat even for many of these declining species. And I've seen it myself, just how much life comes roaring back when you stop doing this to the landscape. This was my yard when we first moved to our home in Sykesville in Howard County. I live on 2 acres, and it was once, you know, mostly lawn and a few Bradford pears and burning bushes and miscanthus that the previous owner had planted. So it was just a vast expanse of either not very helpful plants or just this flat terrain, very, very undergrown. This is what it looks like today. And because we planted native plants and we also just nurture what was already in the seed bank and let the trees grow up and the native ground covers come in, and we have all this thriving floral and faunal community now. So I was going to say probably one of the most important first steps of all that we took was that we decided not to get a beehive. So my husband was actually considering it 25 years ago, and when we first moved to Sykesville, which is where we live. And then we started seeing all these bumblebees on the sunflowers and the zinnias that I was growing from seed. And we wondered, what will happen to these bees if we introduce an entire hive of thousands of other ones? So thank goodness we didn't add that kind of unneeded pressure to our landscape, because really adding a hive is kind of antithetical to actually saving the bees. And this is probably the biggest misconception that people have when thinking about the decline of pollinators, that somehow getting a honeybee hive is going to help mitigate those declines. And as I'm sure some of you know, that actually couldn't be further from the truth, because honeybees are domesticated and they're captive bred animals, and they were introduced here from Europe about 4 centuries ago. And we all love honeybees. They're fascinating creatures, but they're not endangered. And in fact, scientists actually think that there's probably more honeybees in the world now than there ever were before. But they aren't part of our local ecologies. They generally aren't living in the wild. They don't have to fend for themselves like so many of our thousands of other native bee species do here in North America. And you may have seen this quote. It's a good one. It's what Rich Hatfield from the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation told me when I interviewed him for my first book. And it's become kind of a mantra in pollinator conservation. A lot of people say that getting a honeybee hive is fine if you want to use it to have honey or for educational purposes, but getting a honeybee hive to save the bees is like raising chickens to save wild birds. But it's not just that getting a hive doesn't do anything to help native pollinators. It actually can actively introduce some problems for them. There's a lot of competition out there, especially in our residential landscapes, that are already often so devoid of plants. And researchers have found that a single hive of honeybees can collect the same amount of pollen that could support 100,000 solitary single bee moms over the course of one summer. And here's why honeybees have such advantages when they're imported into an area. Honeybee hives have 15,000 to 50,000 bees, whereas most of our native bees are solitary, and they may lay only a half dozen or a dozen eggs or so in their lifetime. Even bumblebees who are more social live in colonies of usually about 50 to 500 bees at the most. Honeybees can forage for miles, whereas some of our native bees are so tiny, they can fly only a few feet before they need to find some flowers or run out of fuel. So that's one reason that we need flowers everywhere, so that there's connectivity for these little guys. Honeybees are generalist foragers with diverse diets, but a great many of our native bees prefer or require certain native plant species. Honeybees have a ready-made apartment for nesting and staying warm. But native bees need to find their own shelter in the ground, in stalks and logs and leaves. And lastly, honeybees sting to defend their nests. They don't sting when they're just out on flowers, right? They don't have any interest in coming after us, but they do sting to defend themselves, which is what makes people so afraid of them in general. But for native bees, the situation is a lot different. We don't need a beekeeper suit to be around native bees, because they don't have hives to defend. Some of them don't even have stingers, and the males don't have stingers. And the ones who do aren't really likely to use them on us. The vast majority are just those solitary nesters. So what does this all add up to? Well, we're finding that the popular trend of getting hives in residential areas is decreasing the diversity and number of native bees. Aside from competition for floral resources, native bees are vulnerable to pathogens and mites that are brought in by honeybee colonies. And studies around the world are showing that in some urban areas there are now more hives than gardens in cities and parks can support. And that means, that's because there aren't enough flowers for the honeybees being introduced to these areas, let alone for the native bees who are already living there. And it's not just impacts on the bees themselves. So this also has implications for plant reproduction. The presence of honeybees can lower pollination and decrease seed set, because native bees are often better pollinators of native plants. They can even be better pollinators of a lot of human food crops, but they're being crowded out in the presence of honeybees. And people often don't realize that. They don't realize just how important native bees are to agriculture. So there was a study a few years ago of 7 major US crops that showed that in most cases, the contributions of wild native bees is similar to or even higher than that of honeybees. They're often more effective pollinators of fruits and vegetables. So here's an example. A single orchard bee is more effective than 25 honeybees at pollinating almonds. And here's another example. Bumblebees are 40 to 60 times more effective than honeybees at pollinating tomatoes, and that yields many more fruits and larger fruits. So if we want to really save the bees, we just need to become wild beekeepers. And it's much easier. It doesn't require any outfits or special equipment at all, except maybe a shovel to plant some flowers. And we can get started with these 5 simple steps we're going to spend some time talking about now. Go bee watching. So learn who bees are and what they need. And to know them is to love them, I think. And the more you start paying attention to bees, the better you'll understand them and their needs. Protect nesting and overwintering sites. So leave the natural materials they need for nesting, and like the fallen leaves and dead wood. Feed the bees. Nurture and plant the plants that bees evolve to eat all season long. Repair the dead zones, meaning stop using pesticides, reduce or eliminate mulch, replace as much turf as possible with native bees, and become an ambassador for bees. So help bust the myths about bees and spread the word about how to help them, because I'm actually part of Howard County Bee City, and I joined because the thing that we do, our primary goal is to educate people about native bees, and it's really interesting to see these things being sort of promulgated over and over again, these myths about honeybees and native bees. So that's why I really try to explore some of the different facts about them and ways that we can get to know them better. I've had an interest in this subject for years, and I've done research, I've read a lot of books, I've talked to a lot of scientists and written a lot of articles, but the best way that I've really been able to learn about bees and other insects has just been to take the time to watch them in my own garden. So a little bit about who our bee neighbors are. Overall, there are 4,000 different bee species in US and Canada, and in Maryland alone, we have more than 400 species of native bees. Bees comprise 7 different families worldwide. And one of those families occurs in Australia. So I've just listed the 6 that are here in the US. The last one, Mellididae, is pretty rare, but if you create habitat in your yard, you're likely to see bees from most of the other families listed here. This is just a sampling of the ones that I've come to know in my habitat. We've seen bees from 5 of the 6 families living in our gardens: bumblebees, leafcutter bees, mining bees, cellophane bees, sweat bees. And bees come in so many different shapes and sizes. It's really astounding to look at these 2 insects here and realize these are both bees. And because of this amazing diversity of species and their different floral preferences and different emergence times and habitats, native bees are collectively pollinating a huge amount of flowers. Their incredible pollination skills are also a result of their anatomy and their lifestyles. So pollen is their jam, literally. They intentionally collect pollen and nectar for their larvae, so they're constantly in touch with those pollen grains. And of course, they're fuzzy, most bees. So the pollen collecting hairs on bees help those pollen grains easily stick to their bodies, and then those grains fall off as the bees move from flower to flower. And flowers need pollen to be moved around in order to be able to set seed. Many native bees buzz pollinate, so that means that they use vibration from flowers to coax pollen from flowers that otherwise aren't going to release those grains. So some plants have evolved to actually require buzz pollination by native bees. Many native bees are flower loyalists, so they specialize on certain species. I heard someone talk about Sam Drogi's lab closing at USGS, which is very unfortunate because he does so much education and awareness to the public about things like specialist bees who need certain native plants or certain genera, certain species to collect pollen to feed their young. And from the plant's perspective, if they have that kind of relationship with a specialist bee, they know they have a very dedicated pollinator who will ensure that the job gets done. This is just a little graphic that I like from the Xerces Society. They're our umbrella organization for Bee City, and it just shows how bees move pollen around from one flower to another and fertilize the ovule and create a seed that way. Bees evolved from wasps, and wasps are pollinators too. We'll get into that and show some of them a little bit later in the presentation. But the big sort of obvious differences between bees and wasps are that bees are usually much furrier, and also bees eat only plants. They eat nectar as adults, and they feed pollen and nectar to their young. They don't eat meat, whereas wasps are usually carnivores and generally feed insects and spiders to their young. And this has led people to quip that bees are hippie wasps because they're long-haired and they're vegetarian. And you can see here why bees are so good at moving pollen around. They can get pretty messy as they forage. This is a carpenter bee mom. And carpenter bees get a bad rap, but they're really just gentle giants. And they sometimes, you know, they're the ones that might get in your face up on your deck or something like that. But they really have no interest in stinging us. They're just defending their territory or looking for mates when they do that. And they're fantastic pollinators, so we need to really be a lot nicer to them than generally humans are to carpenter bees. Leave the dead wood in our landscapes where we can that they can use for nesting. And a lot of other bees and other insects need that wood too. There are a few different ways that bees carry pollen back to their nest. Bumblebees store their groceries in corbicula, which is the name for these pollen baskets on their legs. Honeybees also do this. It's kind of a curved structure where they can pack in the pollen and nectar. Other bees have scopa, which is a collection of dense hairs where the pollen is gathered, and the sweat bee has scopa on her hind legs. Bees in the Megachilidae family, which are the leafcutter bees, the mason bees, the resin bees, they have pollen collecting hairs on their abdomens, so you can see this very yellow belly where this little bee mama is collecting her pollen. Bees can be as small as 1/16 of an inch, and so it's so small that if you see them, you might think that this type of bee is a gnat or something like that. This picture is blown up many times, and I had to zoom in to get this picture of the sweat bee on a boneset flower. And because of the small size of some of those bees, they can pollinate flowers that honeybees and some of the other larger bees, like bumblebees, can't. When honeybees and bumblebees try to go to some of these small flowers, you can see them fall off sometimes. So we need different sizes of bees for different functions in the ecosystem. Small bees are also really good at getting, so that I see the video's a little choppy, but hopefully you can see how they can get down into these little openings, like with these great blue lobelia flowers. The sweat bee going in and out on the right, that's a sweat bee, and then on the left is a masked bee. And I love that all this happened just in a container on my deck. You could put native plants even out on a balcony or a porch, and there's pretty much a guarantee that somebody's going to find it and use it. But in this case, they're so small, you really have to look for them. You might think, oh, nobody's using this if you don't see a bumblebee or something, but there's these little tiny guys. And I mentioned the specialists. Actually, about 1/4 to 1/3 of native bee species are specialists in the eastern half of the U.S., meaning, again, that they collect pollen for their young only from certain flowers. So knowing about that is a good way to start your search when you're bee watching, because you can start looking on native flowers to search for these tiny little specialist bees. And if you look up online specialist bees and Sam Droege or Jared Fowler, you'll see a whole Excel file of all the different native plants around here in the east that are that attract specialist bees. This one's a spring beauty, and it's just one example of this kind of relationship. And she gathers the pink pollen for her young. You can see her pink little pants there. So if she doesn't have a spring beauty flower, she doesn't have any food for her babies. The most recognizable of all these native bees, of course, are bumblebees, partly because they're hard to miss, and they're also some of our most common bees, or at least they were historically. There are 46 different species of bumblebees in the US and Canada, but as I mentioned earlier, almost 1/3 are considered threatened now. One hasn't even been seen at all since 2006. And bumblebees are really important pollinators for a few reasons. They can fly in cold weather. They can fly in lower light than a lot of bees, and they can forage on a lot of different types of flowers. And they have that special talent I mentioned earlier for buzz pollinating flowers. And I want to play what it sounds like. I'm not sure it's going to work with our hybrid situation here. Let me see. So you can hear that. Sorry, people on the phone. I didn't mean to echo there, but that's what buzz pollinating sounds like. And on a quiet day, you can walk by some of these plants and hear this really different, high-pitched kind of a buzz where they're vibrating their flight muscles at a high frequency. And the plants tend to behave this way, withhold their pollen because they're saving it for the insect that can pollinate them best. So honeybees actually can't do this, but bumblebees and some of our other sweat bees, mining bees, buzz pollinate. Flowers are not as passive in these scenarios as they might appear to be when you're bee watching. There's some really intricate interactions going on. There's a lot of give and take between flowers and bees. There was one study on plants in this genus, Winothera, which is the common evening primrose, and the sundrops are in this genus. And it showed that when these plants feel the vibrations of bees nearby, they can actually produce more sugar in their nectar to attract the bees. And here's something else I learned through doing a lot of bee watching. There's always exceptions to the rule. So this is a bee who is not really very hairy at all and very tiny. So you might see this bee and think it's a tiny little wasp or something like that. But a close peek at their faces will reveal that they're actually bees because they have this mask. They're called masked bees or yellow-faced bees. And you can see that rectangular white shape or yellow shape that makes them easy to identify. And since masked bees don't have any hairs to help them gather pollen, they've evolved a totally different strategy where they just eat the pollen and then they regurgitate it into the larval cells when they get back to their nest. And then they seal it up into a nice little package of food for the baby bees. So what are male bees doing while all these female bees are working so hard to provide for the next generation? I mentioned earlier that the male bees are not actually collecting pollen or provisioning nests, but females don't want them in the nest anyway. So this is one of my very favorite parts of bee watching. If you go out in the evening or the early morning, you can find many males under flowers or aggregated together on stems, depending on the species. And it's like they're just hanging out at the bar all night and then sleeping and then getting up and starting to drink again and doing the whole thing all over again, drink and mate and sleep, because that's their job. You might also see long-torn male bees. So I haven't seen this in my habitat, but this is in a garden in DC where the longhorn male bees sleep together at night. And you know, they have it kind of rough because they have to be out in the elements too, like that. So I've got some more cool bees to show you when we get to the habitat portion of this talk, but first I want to introduce you to the rest of them. Unlike bees, these insects here, and also the hummingbirds, they're not typically gathering pollen to feed their young, but they do go to flowers to drink nectar, and some of them also eat the pollen themselves. And so in the process, they end up moving a lot of pollen around and pollinating flowers. But pollinators come in even more surprising shapes and sizes throughout the world. So bats are pollinators in the Southwest, and they're responsible for our happy hours because they pollinate avocados and agave, which is an ingredient in tequila. And some other mammals and lizards are also pollinators. But just last year, a paper came out about this relationship. Did you guys see this? It's really fascinating. The Ethiopian wolf likes to lick the flowers of red hot poker, which are native there. And they get a sweet treat, and it's thought that they're pollinating the plants in the process. And so I asked the photographer today, he's French and he's in Ethiopia, I think on another photo shoot, but if I could use these pictures because they're amazing. You can actually see the pollen on that wolf's little snout there. And I mean, it makes you wonder, what if they're foxes? What if they have a preference for plants here and we just don't know it? Or coyotes or some other animals. There's so many things going on in this wild, beautiful world that they're just waiting to be discovered and we have no idea about. So let's turn to beetles. So they're one of my very favorite insects to watch. I do a lot of beetle watching in my habitat because, partly they just kind of show up. They tend to walk around more slowly, and so you can see what they're doing a bit more. And they're one of the largest and oldest groups of known animals on Earth. There's 400,000 beetle species. That's about 40% of all insect species. They make up 25% of all animal species, so they're incredibly diverse. And we have something like 30,000 beetle species in the US alone. And they have small hairs on their body and brushy mandibles, oftentimes, that can easily pick up pollen grains, so that's part of what makes them helpful pollinators. They evolved with the earliest flowers, so they've been around since long before bees arrived on the scene, for the most part. This little one is a soldier beetle, and as an adult, she eats pollen and nectar, and she transfers pollen around in the process. You can actually see bits of pollen on her legs too here. And different species of soldier beetles and their larvae also eat aphids, caterpillars, and other insects, so they're providing natural insect control services in addition to pollination. A lot of beetles are predatory at different life stages, so ladybugs and their larvae, you probably have seen that. They are voracious aphid eaters. Fireflies spend most of their lives as larvae in the soil and under the leaves, and they're beetles, of course, and they eat slugs and snails and worms and soft-bodied insects. Flowers of many types are sometimes just crawling with different species of beetles who are helping to pollinate them. This is a possum haw viburnum. It's totally abuzz with beetles every June, and if you don't look closely, you might think that they're bees. But beetles don't fly quite as well, and they also often walk around on the flowers a little more than they fly. So they like these flowers that are open and that have accessible pollen. Here's a close-up of one of those flower scarab beetles, and he's so covered in pollen, you can't even tell that he's not actually a yellow insect. He's all brown and black under there. A lot of beetles like the ancient flower forms. So they like the flowers that they first evolved with, the cup shapes, the bowl shapes like magnolias. And the flowers that beetles tend to go to also are usually musky and sweet or spicy scented, like this Carolina allspice. They like pawpaw flowers and wild ginger flowers, and these tend to be sort of red. Sometimes these flowers that look a bit like carrion. And then beetles do so many interesting things other than pollinate. So this is the horned passelis beetle. They're also called best beetles or patent leather beetles. And they're really such gentle animals. They usually inhabit stumps and big logs where they actually live in family groups. And the first generation even often sticks around to help the parents with the second generation. And their job is to eat wood. They eat huge amounts of wood, feed it to their larvae, and relative to their body size, they're really decomposing a lot of stuff and helping to return nutrients to the soil. American carrion beetles, they know where all the bodies are buried, so they can detect the scent of decaying flesh, and then they eat it. They lay their eggs on it too. And researchers have found that sometimes carrion beetles will also eat larvae of other species who've laid their eggs there, and the thought is that they're trying to reduce the amount of competition that their larvae are going to have when they hatch. So they're really planning for these things. And believe it or not, we actually have dung beetles here. I did not know this until I saw one in our garden, and I used to think that dung beetles were all somehow in faraway lands, but of course we have these beetles because someone needs to break down the poo, and so they're nature's ultimate cleanup crew right here at home. And last summer we had some pretty prolific poopers in our habitat. I don't know if they were foxes, raccoons, I think there was a mixture there, leaving them in the pathway, and all this stuff would disappear pretty quickly, and finally we realized it was because we had these dung beetles. We started seeing them there. The diversity of beetles is really just extraordinary. This is one called a locust borer, and they lay eggs in locust trees. And one of their favorite plants to eat is goldenrod. And I think they're just stunningly beautiful, and their coloration is so interesting because they evolved to kind of mimic wasps and bees, and that's a great defense that helps them to keeps them from being eaten by predators who are bee phobic or wasp phobic. And speaking of wasps, I love wasp watching too because we have so many opportunities for that. There are an estimated 100,000 species of wasps worldwide and 13,000 to 18,000 in the US and Canada. So there's at least 3 times more wasp species than bee species. And they're carnivores, as I mentioned. And bees evolved from wasps, but scientifically speaking, bees are actually considered wasps, which is another thing I learned from a book called Solitary Bees by a guy at Cornell, that they're pretty much identical to wasps, but we have this separation just sort of in name only. So again, bees are plant eaters, whereas wasps feed insects to their young. So they gather caterpillars, grasshoppers, spiders, and or they lay eggs in the caterpillars or these other insects, and their larvae then eat those insects when they hatch. But as adults, many wasps go to flowers to eat nectar, and they can also transfer pollen around in the process. And when we think of wasps, we tend to think of social wasps with I cannot say the word wasps with large colonies in the ground, like yellow jackets, but actually those social wasps are just a small fraction of the wasp species out there. Just like most bees, most wasp species nest alone, and they don't have any interest in stinging us. They don't have a hive to defend, and a lot of these solitary wasps don't even have effective stingers anyway. I was lucky enough to be home and able to watch this dark grasshopper hunting wasp and some of her sisters for a while last summer when they were nesting. And I saw them circling like this, and this is what's called an orientation flight, where they're memorizing the visual landmarks so that they can figure out how to get back to their nests. And I don't know if you saw it, but there was also a tiny parasitic wasp trying to get into her nest. I saw a lot of that too, and they would wait for the mother wasp to leave and try to go in there and parasitize her larvae. And then we also watched these wasps capturing grasshoppers, and they did quite a bit of work to bring these guys to their nests. And it's always sad for me to think of the plight of the prey when this happens. I don't really like to watch it, but of course this is nature's way of introducing checks and balances. If there were no one to eat the grasshoppers, then the grasshoppers would end up eating more than their share of plants. Wasps have shorter tongues than bees, so they like these simple, shallow flowers, like late boneset. They like goldenrods, golden alexanders, coreopsis, mountain mints, milkweeds. And these are all plants that wasps will go to for nectar, and then in the process, they'll help pollinate them. And I see these thread-waisted wasps all the time on these flowers. They always seem to be mating. Maybe they're out for just a short time. Oregon pipe mud dauber wasps. These wasps actually provision their nests with spiders, and I was lucky enough to watch them gathering mud one summer during the pandemic. They were mining the mud, and that's how I figured out. I'm not going to play the sound, but it sounds a lot like buzz pollination. It's the same mechanism where they're vibrating their flight muscles at a high frequency to get that mud out of the ground. And it was great to be able to hear this on a quiet day and watch them go and stretch their mud balls out at their nests. And then later I saw the male mud dauber guarding the nest, and he kept sticking his head out to protect it from the cuckoo wasp who was trying to get in there and lay her eggs and parasitize the nest. So these are some very hard-working animals. They're very inconspicuous. We hardly ever even know they're there unless we look up. They're furtive, and they literally wouldn't hurt a fly. They might hurt some spiders, but they wouldn't hurt us. And they're helpful creatures. The bald-faced hornet nest right here was near our patio one year, and we left it up, and it survived the winter to then help birds with nesting material, and birds would peck at it for food. But while it was active, they really did not bother us at all until I got too close one day trying to get a picture, and I got close to the entryway, like about a foot or so, and one came after me, but I booked it away from there, and that didn't happen again. So they're you know, you can, if they're not right in your pathway or right in your doorway, you can coexist with these social wasps as well. And here's another wasp, the paper wasp, and I just wanted to show this video because I think, you know, you can really watch an animal like this up close, and when you see them feeding and drinking and grooming and taking care of their young, you can get a different perspective on who they are and maybe start to understand them more and understand that they have their own lives entirely separate from ours, and they're just trying to survive just like everyone else. Flies are also underappreciated pollinators. There are about 120,000 known fly species globally and 61,000 in North America. There's probably a lot more we don't know about. And without flies, we wouldn't have these things like chocolate, and they pollinate mangoes and black peppers and chili peppers, onions, fennel, carrots, as well as a lot of our native plants. So I see them here on our shrubby St. John's wort. This little dive bomber is also a flower fly, and you can see them sharing a lot of the flowers with bees. That's a masked bee again there in the center. And you might see this one and at first think she's a wasp, very colorful, also a flower fly or syrphid fly or hover fly. And many of the flies that feed on flowers as adults often do mimic bees and wasps, just the way that beetles do, and for the same reason, because this kind of disguise gives them some protection from predators who are afraid of being stung. And here's a funny little flip side to that. This guy is not a pollinator, but I wanted to show him to you anyway because he's so incredibly like a bee at first, but he's not a bee at all. He really fooled me when he landed on our deck rail one summer, and then I started watching him, and his motion was very jerky and twitchy. And his eyes are close together, which is characteristic of a fly. So this is a robber fly, and they disguise themselves as bees, probably to avoid predation, but they might also be doing it as camouflage so they can sneak up on their prey. So prey think it's just a little humble bumble nearby, and then it actually ends up being this fierce robber fly, and they inject a neurotoxin and enzymes that liquefy their prey, and then they suck down the remains like a smoothie. I know, it's gross, but it's interesting. So this is a tachinid fly, and tachinid flies are parasitoids. So like some wasps, they'll lay their eggs on other insects, such as caterpillars and grasshoppers, and then their larvae hatch, and they eat the host insects. So tachinid flies are providing that kind of natural control for insects that would otherwise be eating a lot more plants. And then moths are pollinators too. There are many more species of moths than butterflies, 160,000 globally, 11,000 in the US, and most are nocturnal, but this one is actually a daytime moth, the hummingbird moth. And some moths, like the giant silk moths, they don't eat as adults, but many others do eat nectar, and they can be really efficient pollinators because they can move more quickly than bees oftentimes. And also, moths tend to have a lot of hairs that help them catch the pollen grains. So most moths are working hard while we're sleeping, and there's kind of a growing appreciation now of how much they contribute to pollination and how much things like light pollution not only disrupt their reproduction, but actually can disrupt the seed set of the plants because moths just aren't going to the plants that they normally would. And they have really interesting relationships, some of them. This is a yucca moth on a yucca flower, and when yucca moths emerge in the summer in about a month or so at our place, they come up from the soil right beneath the yuccas, and then they mate on the flowers, and then they lay their eggs there. And then when the caterpillars hatch, they actually eat the yucca seeds. So their entire life cycle here is on the yucca plant. And yucca plants, in turn, depend on yucca moths for pollination. It's pretty much their only or primary pollinator. And of course, moth caterpillars and pupae are the biggest source of food for baby birds. So caterpillars do everything they can to try to hide from foraging bird parents. And this is one you might see in your garden if you see a few petals missing from a plant. and you think maybe a rabbit ate it or something, it might be this little emerald moth caterpillar, because they dress themselves up in all these petals, and they also put seeds and other plant parts on them. This one was dressed up in echinacea petals. And this one is wearing some bits and bobs of Rudbeckia. I watched him last summer in a potted plant, and he also put some of his own frass, which is his poop, on his back, which is pretty funny. Anything for a disguise there. And butterflies help pollinate, but there's kind of a misconception that they're like really great pollinators. You'll see a lot of things out there about how monarchs are pollinators, and they do pollinate, but they're really not as good at it, and it's because they have such precision nectar gathering, and they have long legs, so they're less likely to transfer pollen around than other insects. And there's only about 750 in the U.S. So they're among the insects that are contributing to pollination, but they're not doing that as much as beetles and other insects. Some of our most stunning native plants, like cardinal flowers, rely on hummingbirds for pollination, because the birds have those long beaks that can get down into the deep blooms. Also, spicebush swallowtails, actually, that is a butterfly that helps pollinate cardinal flower, because they have a longer proboscis than some of the other butterflies. So hummingbirds, in turn, also really need these native plants, not only for nectar, but also because the native plants support insects, and they need insects. They need the protein to feed their young and also to eat themselves. So it's good to plant plants for hummingbirds. Even if you have a feeder, it's really good to flesh that out. You know, there's a thought that perhaps the nectar in flowers has other things that maybe sugar water does not have as well, maybe some amino acids and things like that. So anytime you can actually put plants out there instead of artificial habitat is really helpful. So we'll talk now about some more specific ways to help all these animals in the garden. I'm going to put a special emphasis on bees and butterflies and moths here, because if you attend to their needs, you'll pretty much be helping everyone else too. And I'm going to start with the habitat elements that tend to be the most overlooked, all that decaying plant material. And I think the intense focus on monarch butterflies, while it's important, it has exacerbated the lack of attention to these other aspects of pollinator habitat that are needed for overwintering and nesting, because a lot of people see monarchs as a proxy for all butterflies, but really monarchs' lifestyles are anomalous. They migrate. They don't need winter habitat in our gardens here, but that's just not the case for so many other insects. Like these orange sulfurs, they're in decline throughout their range, and they overwinter. Right here is pupae. They attach themselves to stems, but people too often prune those things down in the spring, and they might not even know that they're there. Mourning cloaks are another declining species, and they overwinter under leaves and bark and in brush piles. And earlier I showed you the beautiful hummingbird moth. This is the caterpillar of one of the hummingbird moth species. Before they turn into moths, they have to eat native plants that they've evolved to digest. And this one is eating leaves of coral honeysuckle vine, one of its host plants. And some of you probably have this in your garden, and this is what it looks like in full flower. But there's something else that these hummingbird moths need besides flowers for adults and leaves for caterpillars. When they're ready to pupate in a cocoon, they drop down from the vine and into the fallen leaves, and that's where they spend the winter all cozy and protected under the leafy layer. So they won't ever make it to adulthood or emerge in spring if someone comes along and takes those leaves away. A new study from the University of Maryland confirmed this. The researchers found that when you remove fallen leaves from a residential yard, that action alone reduces butterfly and moth numbers emergence. It reduces their emergence in spring by almost half. It also greatly reduces spider numbers and beetle numbers. And that's what's referred to as an ecological trap, when you're inviting insects and other animals into your garden, and then you're encouraging them to mate, to reproduce, and then you're essentially destroying their progeny. And some of you might have seen that paper from Karen Burkhart and her student Max Filato. It came out in March, but they've done a couple of talks over the past couple of years on this. And she said that they also found that shredding of the leaves is really problematic for butterflies and moths in particular. So some people will shred and mulch leaves and put them back in the garden, but you're disrupting the life cycles of the Lepidoptera if you're doing that. So it's best just to leave leaves where you can, or you can move them under shrubs and under trees. One of the most helpful things you can do is to create what's called a soft landing, and this is a term that was coined by Heather Holm, a pollinator biologist in Minnesota, and her friend Leslie Pilgrim. And essentially it means that instead of having mulch or turf grass around trees, you have native plants, all these neat little native ground cover, sedges, ferns, wildflowers, and leaves that offer nesting and overwintering sites. And this is also critical for insects like queen bumblebees because they emerge in spring and they have to start whole new colonies all by themselves. So they need that insulating leaf layer to get through the cold season. And most bees rely on the ground layer at the nesting stage, but they also use other places too. In general, these are the different types of native bee nesters. We have the solitary ground nesters, the moms who excavate their nests all by themselves, and some of them nest close to each other in aggregations, so you might see them and think it's a bunch of little ant hills. Then there are the cavity nesters who nest in stems, stalks, stumps, logs, even bricks. And then you have semi-social nesters, and these bees raise their young on their own, but then they share the entranceway with moms and other nests. And then colony nesters are mainly bumblebees. The mothers and daughters live together. Of all those different ways of nesting, by far the most common nesting site is just plain soil. About 80% of North American bee species are ground nesters, and they include cellophane bees and mining bees, digger bees, mast bees, some of the sweat bees. And it's pretty easy to provide the habitat that they need. This is an area under our deck where there are dozens of native bee nests made by a species called rufous-backed cellophane bees. They're just about to emerge. And they're solitary moms, and they each make their own nests, but they have this habit of nesting close to each other. So you can probably see a few of those little dirt piles there that look like ant hills. And really you have to pay close attention to see them because they're so fast and they're so shy. And I set up my camera so I could show this behavior. And this little cellophane bee went into her nest for about 3.5 minutes with her provisions. And then when she popped back out, you can see her head here. She's trying to make sure the coast is clear. And I couldn't make one move without her popping right back in. I had to set up my camera and just walk away. That's how skittish these bees are. People get scared when they think of bees nesting in the ground, but you know, they're much more scared of us than we are of them. And this is a neat little diagram that I found from NC State Extension, just showing simply what the cellophane bees are doing underground. They're excavating that main tunnel, and then they're making little offshoots, a separate tunnel for each of their eggs. And then inside that tunnel, they're putting a slurry of nectar and pollen in there. And the larvae will have those provisions as they're developing over the summertime. And the reason these bees are called cellophane bees is that they line the cells with this substance that they secrete from a gland in their abdomens, and it's to waterproof the inside of the brood cells.
How deep is that?
You know, I was told it was pretty deep. I interviewed some folks at Cornell who are running a project called Ground Nesting Bee Project on iNaturalist, and I was a little bit worried that after they're in there, am I disturbing them when I have to step on it to water a plant or something? It varies by species, but they can be as deep as a foot underground. This particular cellophane bee is a generalist, so they can go to lots of flowers. But wouldn't you know it, their favorite one seems to be the tulip tree flower, which are starting to bloom right now in my habitat, just in time for the mamas to come out and forage there. So it's just neat to see how the native bees have evolved along with the plants that they prefer. And this is a really good thing to know. So this is a completely harmless little swarm of male bees. I'm going to play the video here. Someone came up to me after a talk last year and asked me about this. And he said, it looks a lot like those cellophane bees you were showing, but they were swarming. And often those male bees will emerge first, and they're waiting for the female bees and going to the plants that the female bees prefer, waiting for them to come out so they can mate right away. In this case, they were also interested in this post, and it turns out this couple's dog likes this post, and so they were going to the post to get amino acids and salts and things like that from the dried urine. And these are nests of another kind of cellophane bee called the unequal cellophane bee. It comes out earlier. And this is a closer up view, and I wanted to show these because this is just in a pathway, at the edge of a pathway that was mowed. And this bee emerges in March or, late March, early April. And they like these sparse places between the grass, and it turns out you can have a lot of good nesting sites in lawn if it's not manicured. If you have this sort of old lawn with clovers and all of this stuff that's kind of sparse and thinly vegetated, some of these bees really, really like that as habitat. And you can create space in the garden for them just by cutting out the mulch and leaving some bare ground. And you don't want to add mulch in a space like this because you could end up smothering nests and preventing bees from being able to emerge. And the thing is, these native perennials are just getting going here in the early spring, and so it only looks like this for a short time. Pretty soon this ground is going to be covered by these wood asters and other little plants nearby. So the rest of our native bees, maybe about 20%, nest primarily in decaying wood, and people often think only of carpenter bees doing this because they have the ability to actually excavate their own holes. But most cavity nesting bees are using existing holes that have already been made by other animals, usually by beetles. And these bees here are both in the Halictidae family. So they're both sweat bees, and Halictidae are the most abundant native bees. In the wild and in natural habitat, no one's taking dead wood away. And gardeners and homeowners aren't really used to the concept of letting this decaying plant matter be. I think it's getting more popular now, but if you start incorporating dead wood, your garden can become a lot more beautiful. These types of trunks and cut tree trunks and stumps and logs and stuff are really like sculptural assets in natural hardscaping. They start to gather this beautiful fungi. And we'll often place log pieces of tree trunks along pathways, like you can see them in the back there behind our little pond. And sometimes that's actually a good guard against herbivory for plants you're trying to get established too along a pathway. If you need to visually sort of hide your dead wood, you could do things like this, use it as a pedestal for a bird bath or put a flower pot on top. And this is just to show a smaller subset of cavity nesting bees who use pithy or hollow stalks and twigs. And they can usually only do this if the stalks are broken or cut. This is a leafcutter bee in a stalk of a showy goldenrod from the previous summer that the gardener had cut down to about a foot. And she's scraping out the pith so she can lay her eggs. This is a neat example from my co-chair of Bee City in Howard County, Julie Costantino. She cut the stems of her wild bergamot last spring, and then the next week found evidence of a mama bee there excavating. You can see the little dust there from where she was digging into the stem. And the bees who mostly do this are Ceratina, they're dwarf carpenter bees. And here at the bottom you can see what the inside of a stem looks like, where the mother is making a separate brood cell for each of her larvae, and then she puts this bee bread of pollen and nectar in the chamber. And this is a list of some of the shrubs and wildflowers used by twig nesters. Typically in the wild, these plants would actually be broken by deer and rabbits browsing the twigs, or animals stepping on them and breaking them. If you come across these kind of round-shaped holes in leaves, you know you have leafcutter bees nesting somewhere, because mother leafcutter bees use their mandibles to cut these leaf pieces to line their nests with. And sometimes the nesting choices are quite unusual. This was an abandoned pipe at a campsite. Leafcutter bees also use flower petals, and in this case, this was in the garden of a friend of mine in Florida. She's a bee photographer, and she saw this leafcutter bee using partridge pea petals to go inside a seed head of a horseweed and navigate through a spider web to get in there and line her little nest with flower petals, which was really quite amazing. Sometimes people purchase insect hotels for cavity nesting bees, but generally speaking, these aren't great. They don't really serve the purpose that they're intended for usually. They're often made incorrectly. They're too short. They can easily harbor disease if they're not cleaned well. And the larvae of bees like this one might be more prone to being preyed upon by wasps because they're so concentrated here and it's easy to get to them. So it's best if you can just have natural habitat, some dead wood and things like that. The social bees, the bumblebees, love abandoned rodent nests. They often use old mouse nests on the ground. And they've been known also to use old squirrel nests and chipmunk tunnels. And it's a really good reason not to use rodenticides because our little small mammals in their own way are actually contributing to pollination in that way. And this colony here is tending to a growing brood. These orange balls are pollen balls that the queen lays her eggs on, and she covers them with wax. But bees aren't going to be able to do this in manicured grass that's mowed and fertilized and cut short. There's going to be nothing for them to use there. The other animals aren't going to nest there. Some bumblebees, like the American bumblebee, like to nest in a place that's even more specific. So tall grasses that have fallen over from the past season. So I don't cut all my grasses, the native grasses in the garden, because sometimes they're already in there using them. I saw bumblebees going into the tufted hair grass early in the spring, and that tends to be sort of semi-evergreen, but there's a lot of decaying material too that they like, and I just left it there, and the new green grows over it. So in addition to the plant species I've already shown, I just wanted to give a few pointers here about what pollinators are looking for. Native flowering trees provide a lot of food, especially for bees emerging in the spring, partly because there's so many flowers on them, and also many of them bloom earlier than other plants. Redbuds, they have this just frenzy of bumblebees and carpenter bees. If you walk by, you can hear the buzz early in the spring. Red maple is also an important tree for bees. It's one of the earliest bloomers. Lots of the small solitary bees go to it. The mining bees, sweat bees, mason bees, there's cellophane bees, and it is a very popular place for males to go and do their little swarms in search of females. Sumacs in the roost genus, they're not related to poison sumac, but unfortunately the common name confuses people, so they often don't end up planting these, but they're just incredible trees for bees. You really do have to look up to see them once these sumacs get going, because they're pretty tall, but you can hear this amazing buzz when you're near one of these trees. Black chokeberry, red chokeberry, chokecherries, they're all great for early emerging bees. Allegheny blackberry, another good one for mining bees and bumblebees. Trees and shrubs can also feed some of those specialist bees. There are mining bees that specialize on dogwood. And you probably know about the violet miner bee that specializes on violet, can only gather pollen for her young from that plant. And also there's great spangled fritillaries who are in decline. They also need violets for their caterpillars. You can welcome hummingbirds back in the spring with columbines and coral honeysuckle vines, these specially made plants that are perfect fit for hummingbird beaks and so gorgeous to have in the garden. In summer especially, it's important to include plants that have those long bloom times and feed all different kinds of pollinators, because then you'll always have food for as many insects as possible at the height of the season. The rudbeckias, the helianthus, so the black-eyed Susans, the sunflowers, the blue mistflower, those are all great ones. Mountain mints. They're a pollinator bonanza. No deer or rabbits like to eat these, and they bloom all summer long. So if you can only have room for a few plants, I would put a mountain mint in, because it's kind of a dizzying sight. You can learn about a lot of insects you might never have seen before if you plant a mountain mint. Wild bergamot, another really popular plant among insects that blooms for a long time in midsummer. Native thistles, incredibly important to pollinators, but because the drums have been beaten so loudly about Canada thistle and bull thistle, a lot of people don't realize we have this native one. And it's just pure magic when it flowers. You would not believe all the insects that come to it. If you don't have it yet, I highly recommend it. And it doesn't spread the way the other thistles do. I wish it did spread a little more. It seeds a bit, but people think of milkweeds usually only for monarchs, but bees are pretty excited about milkweeds too. Sweat bees, bumblebees. I've seen sphinx moths at night when we go out to watch the fireflies. They go to milkweed at night. Sure you all know about asters and goldenrods. There's 60 specialist bees that go to these plants, that need these plants for pollen and nectar, or for specifically for pollen from these plants. And many species of moths and butterflies too need them for their caterpillars. Goldenrods are not ragweed. I just want to emphasize that they're completely different plants, because they're often confused with ragweed, and it's one of the reasons we don't see them enough in our landscapes, and it's sad for those poor bees. So many of their favorite plants here are maligned. So I'm hoping that we can make it our plant of the year for Bee City, so we can give it a new reputation. This is the latest season flower we have in our habitat and generally in this area, the snakeroot. And it is really needed at that time of the season, like October, even into late October. All these different butterflies and bees and wasps and flies use it. Okay, so just a couple more things. Beyond planting, we need to repair what I think of as the dead zones by eliminating pesticides, reducing mulch, replacing unused lawn spaces with native plants. Pesticides are one of the biggest reasons now for the decline of pollinators, of course. These are neonicotinoids, pyrethroids, and other broad-spectrum insecticides that are killing everything. And these products make grubs sound bad when grubs are actually just beetle larvae. And fireflies are beetles, ladybugs are beetles. As we've seen, there's all kinds of other beetles who are also pollinators and predators and decomposers and prey. So treating lawns with this stuff and thinking that you're only going after one thing is just tragic. And then mosquito spraying, a big issue in our area. And there's a New Xerces Society study. It's been submitted for publication, but it hasn't come out yet. But I wrote about it in a recent article in American Gardener and interviewed them about it. And they essentially set up silicone bans in yards in 3 states where people were hiring mosquito spraying companies. And so they were able to test just how much residue was getting on these bans and at what levels. And it was enough, of course, to kill butterflies and bees. And in some cases, it was multiple times higher than the LD50 for honeybees. So it was extremely toxic. The drift in the yards next to it was lower, but still problematic. And there's all kinds of other interesting research about this coming out. I know we all know that mosquito spraying with pyrethroids is killing all insects. But people are actually doing the work and quantifying it. And there's research in Boulder, Colorado, where they have never sprayed for the past 22 years since they had a West Nile outbreak. They've never done adult mosquito spraying. They've only selectively treated with BT when needed for larvae. And they have the lowest threshold for risk of disease. They've never gone above it, whereas the surrounding municipalities that spray all the time are sometimes multiple times above the threshold for risk of disease transmission to humans. So another really interesting thing if you want to talk to your neighbors about it. And of course, there's so many alternatives that are actually much more effective because adult spraying only goes at the adults, it doesn't go at the source. And the source is standing water, which is where those mosquitoes breed, even in as small of an amount as a teaspoon. So you just need to dump your standing water, refresh your bird baths frequently. You can use a fan if you're outside having dinner or something like that, because mosquitoes can't fly in the wind, and apply personal repellents. So, oh, I forgot to say too, the last one, you know, just be a bee ambassador. Put a sign up, talk to your neighbors, and that was supposed to be before this slide. So now we have time for questions, I guess. We went a few minutes over. But thank you.
Nancy, thank you so much for your really informative lectures. Anyway, this is a little bit off, but the other day I saw maybe a dozen or more white snakeroot plants, and they were very, very robust. There were no flowers on them, of course, and they were covered in flies. I mean, hundreds of flies.
Oh,
Have
interesting.
you ever seen that before? And
No, but I wonder if they're getting so it was on the leaves?
they were on the leaves.
If they're getting a chemical from the leaves, because that's the plant that was toxic to cows and caused milk sickness.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I can't remember the name of the substance, but that's why deer don't eat it, and rabbits and things like that.
Mhm.
That's so interesting. I don't know.
It was really interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
just hundreds of flies. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Deja Butler, and I wanted to talk to you. You said something tonight kind of like got me in the heart, kind of sad, because I'm doing a structure here at Tacoma Park that's like a 10-foot insect hotel, to name it in a small way, but it's a hexa habitat. And it's going to be in front of the Tacoma Park Recreation Center. And I just, you know, I work really hard. I'm a teacher also, and I've worked really hard to show my kids how we can help create habitats where maybe there's manicured lawns and not a lot of space for the leaves and stuff. So I guess my question to you is, as I'm finalizing the garden to go around this sculpture, I have had a lot of pushback with people saying that the plants that I want will take over and will spread, and they're worried about that. And a lot of the plants that you did tonight, it was like the ones that I really wanted. So I just wanted to know maybe some advice. And maybe even after a talk.
Oh, sure.
to
And
help.
and with the insect hotel, so it's with all of these things. It's not like there's like a yes or no, this is good, this is bad. So, and if you're talking insect hotel for all sorts of insects, I'm sure it's going to be helpful.
Pollinators.
Yeah.
bees,
It's if it's big, I mean, I'm sure that it'll be helpful to a lot of insects. It's just, you know, I don't want people to just put a little box and think that's all they have to do. And because that's what people do with birds too. They'll just put a little bird box or bird feeder and that's it. And you know, you can end up creating traps that way. But in an urban setting where there isn't much else dead wood, there aren't these other things. I mean, it'd be really interesting to see what you can do with something that's more thought out. But you know, there are these little things you can get at stores that are just cheap and not well made, and yeah. I just wrote another piece called something like In Praise of Prolific Plants. It's one of my favorite subjects. I mean, I don't know why people are afraid of spreading plants, because you can always move them if you have to. And I mean, we're the ones that are spreading most of all. We need a lot more plants, and we need those plants that are really resilient and that will cover the ground. And yeah, so yeah, I can definitely talk to you after. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the presentation, really informative. I was just wondering your thoughts regarding cleaning up of leaves, but waiting later in the season to do that, I had read that if you wait, excuse me, sorry, pollen is still.
I know.
If you wait at least 10 days when the lowest temp is 50 degrees at night, waiting 10 days, then that allows the opportunity for all the insects and everything living in the leaf litter to then disperse and leave. And I mean, I do have, I have a ton of leaves in my yard, and I really can't just leave them whole because they just don't decompose.
Right, do you have oak
quickly.
trees or?
I have a lot of oak trees.
Yeah.
And so I've waited now,
Yeah.
and I have been shredding them, but I just want to hear your thoughts.
If you can
on-
leave some in some areas, like under trees, under shrubs, around some plants, there are situations where you don't have acres of land, or you're in the city, or you have a lot of oak trees, or what have you, where or you have some lawn you want to preserve, where you're going to have to move things. So, I mean, so there's a spectrum, right? So the best thing is just leaving them, but obviously you can't be burying your whole house in leaves if that's the case. So what can you do from there? You can leave it in certain areas. Mulching will affect those, or shredding will affect those butterflies and moths. It didn't affect a lot of other insects they looked at as much, but butterflies and moths it did.
even
but-
after even waiting?
Yeah, well, yeah, because you can't really time things that way with, so for example, fireflies, sometimes they'll spend 2 or 3 years under the leaves as larvae. So some of these insects are there, year round there's going to be insects there. Like in the fall, there's going to be those queen bumblebees going under. And in the spring, some pollinators are emerging throughout the summer. So it's not just like in the early spring and early summer. Some of them are coming out in the fall, some of the bees. And so the timing of the weather is only going to apply to certain species. The temperature. I know, I've seen that, and I think that recommendation of 50 degrees has been kind of argued down a lot by entomologists, just because it's not, you can do that, you can save some things, but you're still going to affect other ones.
All right, so what? The leaves just can't stay there.
Well,
though.
yeah, you can't, that's what I'm saying.
Help me process or help me understand what I can do to try and be more bee and or insect friendly, not destroying everything, but yet I also have to get rid of some of the leaves. They
Well,
just
if you have
can't
to, then
stay
you
there.
have to. Like, I mean, if you're leaving some in the places where you can,
Right.
then that's a lot better than most people are doing, right? I mean, I'm not gonna look askance at you for it. I know the problem that you're talking about. I don't know that there's a solution other than doing the best you can with what you have. If you have friends you can give intact leaves to, you might be able to preserve some of them that way.
No one wants the leaves. No,
Yeah.
no one wants the leaves.
Yeah, I'll take the leaves, but it'd be a big long drive for me.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
One of your pictures was of a Virginia bluebell, and don't mulch between flowers.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh my gosh, am I guilty of that? It's just so. Tell me more about mulching.
Yeah. I had so many things to say in here. I had to cut some of that, but yeah, I'm glad you asked. So, I mean, I mulch temporarily when I first plant something. Sometimes if I'm killing grass or something I know that's going to come back, but not as a permanent solution. So, a lot of native plant gardening and wildlife gardening for the long term involves using those dense ground covers, using matrix style planting and letting little native ground covers come up and stay, like even things like oxalis and the geums and these volunteer plants that can fill in these little spaces, because the bees can find their way around that. We had a class a couple of years ago, a plant ID class at a local place, and it was, a bee ID class. And so we brought people outside to ID spring emerging bees in the rain garden that was there. And what we saw instead were mama cellophane bees circling around this garden that had been just mulched deeply the day before between all the pollinator plants. So they didn't realize it, but they smothered all these nests in progress. So that's the kind of thing I think that happens a lot. Either the nests get smothered or you prevent the nests from even being made because they need access to that soil. And so if you can have, again, you can have some of these even mowed pathways where they'll nest too. They'll nest even on the edge of driveways and things like that. But those are sort of, I think those are sort of difficult to predict and create. Like those are sort of accidental bee nesting sites. Whereas if you are creating a garden specifically for pollinators, that is one thing you can easily do to help the solitary bees, the solitary wasps. Just use plants as quote unquote green mulch or living mulch instead of wood mulch.
Another question. If I can remember it. What about, I have a lot of clay soil, so I'd like to, amend it or, get more organic in it. But I mean, where I saw, where you were showing nests, ground nests, it was in a lot softer soil than clay. So I just wondered about, trying to work with the soil and improving the soil.
That's an area that's very dry under the deck, and so it got pretty sandy. And then we had to have the deck repaired, and all that got dug up. And so it was a big disturbance to that area. And they ended up liking that. What the soil combination is, I don't know, but I know that in those unmowed or those mowed, sparsely vegetated lawns that are not kept dense and fertilized and all that, the bees like it there too because it's kind of sandy. And the ground nesting bee project, the scientists at Cornell, they're actually asking people to submit when they see these aggregate sites, no matter where they are, of bees on iNaturalist, and if the person seems willing, they'll ask them to take soil samples, and their idea is that they're going to hopefully create recommendations for how to make a bee bed. There's a lot of research going on right now among bee scientists trying to figure out what type of soil is really, like one person I talked to said it's a black box for them to try to figure out what the preferences are and how to plan for it. But the one thing we know is that giving them access is the first thing. And there's different types of bees, and some of them actually really like the compacted soil. So I don't know that having clay is going to preclude, your bees from being able to use it.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you for your presentation. I was troubled to hear, this is the second time I've heard that Sam Droege has been losing his funding.
Yeah.
Can you comment on what's going on in terms of federal funding for pollinators, this kind of research?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's devastating. I think we all have to, if we have an interest, you know, write to our Congress people and do what we can to lobby for this not to happen. And there's been on the email bee monitoring listserv that Sam started, there's a sample letter that some of the bee researchers put together for people to, you know, modify and tailor and add their own experiences to how the bee lab has helped their state, how it's helped bees, how it's helped them, and so that's one thing, and that's been circulating online too. I think, to me, it also indicates that it's more important than ever for us to have these local projects, local gatherings, local initiatives that we can do together that the federal government can't stop us from doing. It's right now, these next few years, I don't know what else we can do to try to help save these insects. But that is certainly one thing that can make a difference if more people are doing it. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, Nancy, thank you very much for coming out. That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think everybody else did. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well,